Asterisk, have you ever opened a history book and felt nothing? No spark, no drama, just endless names, dates, and dust. Well, that's exactly where our story begins. But this time, something unusual is about to happen. Meet Maine, a curious soul who never believed history could be exciting. One rainy afternoon, while flipping through an old library shelf, Maine stumbled upon a book with a strange title, The Lost Pages of Boring History. At first, it looked like every other dry, lifeless text. But when Maine turned the very first page, something impossible happened. The words began to move. Asterisk. Maine stared at the page. The words weren't just printed letters anymore. They were shifting, almost like ripples on water. He blinked twice, rubbed his eyes, but the letters continued to rearrange themselves until they formed a glowing sentence. Not all history is boring, but to see the truth you must step inside. Maine laughed nervously. Step inside. Endi naja spate. Endi naja. Intines bait teenaja subdeen. What does that even mean? He whispered. But before he could close the book, the pages lifted like wings, and a sudden pull dragged him forward. The library disappeared. In its place was a narrow cobblestone street under a cloudy sky. Maine looked down. His sneakers were gone. He was wearing old leather boots covered in dust. The sound of horses clattered in the distance, and merchants shouted from wooden stalls. Wait, am I inside the book? Maine said aloud. A tall man with a long feathered hat walked by, holding a giant scroll. Without even glancing at Maine, the man muttered, "Ah yes, another one trapped in the lost pages." Maine tried to stop him. "Excuse me, what do you mean trapped?" But the man vanished around the corner. The village of endless lists. The street opened into a dull village square. Everything looked boring. The buildings were gray. The people spoke in monotone voices, and every single stall sold nothing but old paper. Man picked up one sheet, tax records, year 1423. He picked another, attendance list, royal banquet. Maine sighed. So this is it. This is the world of boring history. Just endless lists of nothing. The small boy tugged at his sleeve. His clothes were plain, his expression even plainer. "You shouldn't touch those papers," the boy said. "They're cursed. Everyone who reads them forgets why they came here." Man crouched down. "Who are you?" The boy looked around nervously. "I'm Elias, and if you really want to escape this place, you'll have to find the lost pages, the real ones, not these lists." Man raised an eyebrow. "And where do I find them?" Elias whispered. "Beyond the Hall of Timelines. But be careful. The longer you stay here, the more boring you become. The Hall of Timelines." Together, Maine and Elias walked out of the square and into a giant hall. It stretched endlessly, with walls stacked high with dusty books. Each book floated slightly above the shelves, glowing faintly. Man picked one and opened it. Inside, every page had only one sentence. "On this day, nothing important happened." He shook his head. "No wonder people call this boring." But then Elias pointed at a door at the far end of the hall. Unlike the others, it shimmered with faint golden light. Above it, carved into stone, were the words, "The stories that never made it." Man felt a rush of energy. "That's it, isn't it? That's where the real lost pages are." Elias nodded. "Yes, but the keepers won't let you pass easily. The keepers appear." The air grew colder. Suddenly, the books along the walls began to flap open, pages spinning like wings. Out of the spinning paper clouds, figures formed, tall, pale guardians with blank faces. They carried giant quills like spears. Elias whispered. "They are the keepers of boredom. Their job is to protect dullness, to make sure no one finds the real stories." Maine felt his heartbeat rise. "So, what do we do now?" Elias smiled for the first time. "We run." The two dashed through the hall as the keepers chased them, their footsteps echoing like thunder. Man dodged flying pages, leapt over scrolls that tried to trip him, and finally reached the golden door. He grabbed the handle. It was warm, alive. As he pushed it open, a bright light poured through, nearly blinding him. The keeper stopped at the doorway, unable to cross. Their voices merged into a dull chantate. "Return to boredom! Return to boredom!" But Maine and Elias stepped through the light anyway. What lies beyond? On the other side, the world was different. The colors were vivid, the air buzzing with energy. Tall banners waved in the wind, musicians played, and people told stories with laughter and fire in their eyes. Maine's jaw dropped. This doesn't look boring at all." Elias nodded. Because these are the stories that history forgot to tell, the exciting ones, the human ones. They're hidden here, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them back. Maine smiled. Then I guess I found the right book. The air smelled of roasted nuts, fresh bread, and something sweet Maine couldn't quite name. He and Elias stepped into a bustling market, very different from the dull gray village they had left behind. Here, every stall overflowed with stories. One sold glowing jars filled with tiny scenes, like lightning bugs trapped in glass. Another displayed old shoes that whispered their journeys aloud when you picked them up. A woman with long silver hair sat behind a table covered in scrolls. As people read them, their eyes widened, and some even laughed out loud. Maine couldn't believe it. So this is what boring history was hiding. Elias nodded. Yes, these are the forgotten stories, moments too small for kings and generals, but big enough to matter for real people. Maine picked up a glowing jar. Inside, he saw a miniature scene of two kids racing across a field, chasing a paper kite. The laughter was faint, but it felt alive. This is beautiful, Maine whispered. Why wasn't this in the books? The silver-haired woman answered without looking up. Because official history cares only for wars, rulers, and records. But the heart of history lives in the little things. Joy, struggle, hope. These pages never made it into the books, so they found their way here. The story merchant. The woman finally looked at Maine. Her eyes were bright like she had seen centuries pass. You're not from here, she said. You carry the scent of the outside world. Maine laughed nervously. Is that a good thing? It depends, she replied. Most people fall asleep in the dull pages and never wake again. But you've opened the golden door. That means you're chosen to carry a story back. Elias stepped closer. He can't do it alone. The keepers will follow us. The woman handed Maine a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover shimmered with shifting letters that refused to stay still. This is your key, she said. Write what you see, and the story will live. But beware. Once written, the keepers will hunt you harder than ever. Man took the notebook, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy, but it carried a strange pull, like holding responsibility itself. Trouble in the market. Just as Maine tucked the notebook into his jacket, a cold wind swept through the market. The stalls flickered, the glowing jars dimmed, and people froze mid-motion. Elias grabbed his arm. They found us. At the far end of the street, shadows stretched into tall figures. The keepers. Their blank faces turned toward Maine, and their quills gleamed like polished steel. Run, Elias shouted. The two bolted down a narrow alley, weaving between stalls. The ground beneath them trembled as the keepers marched closer. A jar toppled, shattering into glowing fragments that scattered like fireflies. Maine almost stopped to catch them, but Elias pulled him forward. No time, Elias yelled. They burst out of the market into an open courtyard, only to find more keepers waiting. Maine's heart pounded. They were surrounded, the first escape. The silver-haired woman appeared again, standing on a balcony above them. She raised her hand, and the scrolls from her stall flew into the air like giant paper birds. They dove at the keepers, wrapping around their faces, blinding them for a moment. Go, she shouted. Head to the river of half-told tales. Maine and Elias sprinted as the paper birds held the keepers back. But Maine could hear the sound of quills slicing through parchment. The keepers were tearing free. Finally, they reached the edge of the market where a wooden bridge arched over a wide river. The water shimmered strangely, carrying broken sentences and floating paragraphs downstream like driftwood. Words tumbled together, some fading, others glowing faintly. Elias stopped to catch his breath. We made it. For now. Maine leaned over the railing, watching the words drift by. He read one aloud. Draftism to Jev. More GD. The baker who gave bread to strangers every night. Another floated past. The girl who planted a single seed that grew into 1,000 flowers. Maine's chest tightened. These are incredible. Why aren't these the stories we learn? Elias shrugged. Because they're too ordinary for rulers. But they're extraordinary for the people who lived them. A choice to make. Suddenly, the notebook in Maine's pocket grew warm. He pulled it out, and the pages fluttered open on their own. A glowing line appeared across the paper, cried, and the story will survive. Maine hesitated. He didn't know what to write. Ekax. But then he looked back at the drifting words, fading as the river carried them away. He pressed the notebook against the railing and began to scribble the baker who gave bread to strangers, the girl who planted a seed of hope. As the words filled the page, the fading fragments in the river flared brightly and lifted into the air, swirling around him. The keeper's chant echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder. Return to board. The bridge creaked as Maine and Elias stepped onto the far side of the river. The night sky above shimmered strangely, like ink spreading across a page. In the distance, rising high above the rolling hills, stood a tall black silhouette. The Tower of Unfinished Legends. It looked impossible, stretching higher than any mountain. Parts of it seemed half-built, with stairways that led to nowhere, and windows that opened into empty air. As the wind blew, Maine could swear he heard whispers drifting down from its walls, half-formed sentences, broken tales, and voices that longed to be completed. "That's it," Maine whispered. "That tower." Elias nodded. "Yes, every story that was started but never finished ends up there. Abandoned dreams, forgotten heroes, tales that stopped halfway through. If you want to survive in this world, Maine, you'll need to go inside, at the tower gates." The gates of the tower were carved from stone, covered in words that shifted like shadows. Maine reached out and brushed his fingers across them. The letters moved beneath his touch, forming questions. Will you finish what others left behind? Do you carry the courage to continue? The notebook in his pocket grew warm again, almost urging him to answer. Maine swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, I'll try. The gates groaned open, and a cold rush of air swept past them. Inside, the tower was vast and echoing. Staircases spiraled upward, lined with floating parchments and broken quills. The walls glowed faintly, each brick holding a fragment of an unfinished tale. Hall of Forgotten Heroes. Elias led Maine into the first chamber. Tall statues lined the hall, figures of knights, wanderers, poets, and dreamers. But each statue was incomplete. Some were missing their faces, others had no arms or feet, as if someone stopped sculpting halfway through. Man stepped closer to one. Its plaque read, Aaron, the boy who set out to find the last star. But his story was never told. The statue's empty eyes seemed to plead with him. This is what happens, Elias said softly. When stories are abandoned, their heroes fade. They are trapped in silence. Maine felt a chill. He clutched the notebook. Can I finish them? Elias's eyes gleamed. That's why the tower allowed you in. The whispering stairs. They climbed the spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing. All around them, half-formed voices whispered. Maine could hear fragments and then she opened the door, but the battle began, yet no one he promised he would return, though each whisper cut off, leaving Maine aching to know the end. Finally, they reached a chamber high in the tower. A massive desk stood in the center, covered in scattered manuscripts. A single candle burned, though no one was there to tend it. Maine stepped forward. On the desk lay hundreds of pages, each beginning with promise but stopping after a few lines. One read, the sailor built a ship to chase the horizon, and then nothing. Maine sat down, pulled out the shimmering notebook, and began to write. His pen moved quickly, filling in endings the stories had lost. The sailor built a ship to chase the horizon. He never reached the edge, but along the way he taught others to dream of open seas. And in that dream, he found his freedom. The words glowed, lifted from the notebook, and flowed into the unfinished page on the desk. Suddenly, a figure appeared by the window, a sailor with bright eyes, smiling at the horizon before fading into light. Maine gasped. I just gave him an ending. Elias's voice was steady. That's your gift. You bring life where others left silence, the keeper's shadow. But the moment of triumph did not last. The candle flickered, the air grew heavy, and then silence fell over the tower. From the staircase below, a sharp scraping sound echoed upward, a quill dragging against stone. Maine froze. They found us again. Elias's jaw tightened. The keepers, they don't want these stories completed. They want history to remain empty, unfinished. The shadows stretched along the walls, climbing toward them. Blank faces emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on the glowing notebook in Maine's hand. Return to silence, they hissed in unison. Return to boredom. Maine's heart pounded. He clutched the notebook tighter, his knuckles white. No, not this time. He bent over the desk and wrote furiously, his words glowing brighter and brighter. The boy who faced the shadows found courage in the stories he carried, and in that light, the shadows could not stay. The glow erupted, filling the chamber. The keepers staggered back, hissing as the light burned through their darkness. For a moment, Maine thought they were gone, but then one keeper remained larger than the rest. Its quill was jagged, its cloak heavier than night itself. It stepped forward unshaken. Elias whispered, that one is their leader. A new test. The towering key.